How's everyone doing? All right, so we're about to get started. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come see our event. That was weird. But yeah, so Bullitt History Medicine Club, we're actually, I don't know if anyone knew this, I didn't know before I joined, but the oldest medical school club at UNC. I'm Cheyenne Lashani, first year medical student.
I'm Catherine, oldest, also first year medical student. Y'all probably know us though.
Yeah, you guys might know us. So today's lecture is by Nancy Toms. It's called Panic in the Streets. It's a historical reflections on fear-based media messaging during acute public health crises and is co-presented by university libraries. Before we get started, some housekeeping. So there will be a Q&A at the end. For people on Zoom, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box. This lecture will be recorded and available on University Library's YouTube page and linked from the Bullitt Club website. Please note that many past lectures on the website are currently unavailable.
All right, now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Nancy Toms is a SUNY Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at Stony Brook University. After earning her PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 1978, she joined the history department at Stony Brook University. Along with many articles and several edited collections, Toms has authored 4 books: A Generous Confidence, Thomas Story Kirkbride, and the Art of Asylum Keeping, Madness in America, Cultural and Medical Perceptions of Mental Illness Before 1914, The Gospel of Germs, Men, Women, and the Microbe of American Life, winner of both an American Association for the History of Medicine's Welch Medal and History of Science Society Davis Prize, and remaking the American Patient, How Madison Avenue and Modern Medicine Turned Patients into Consumers, winner of the 2017 Bancroft Prize. Tom's research has been supported by the World Health Organization, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Library of Medicine, and the National Humanities Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the National Institute for Mental Health. She's a big deal. She recently published World Health Organization Health Evidence Network Synthesis Report 77, What are the historical roots of the COVID-19 epidemic? Lessons from the past. She is currently a fellow at the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, where she is working on a longer version of that project.
Yeah, so a little bit more about what we're going to see today. So Dr. Tom's talk today is, like I mentioned, Panic in the Streets. In general, it's like just a little bit more about it. In public health, fear-based campaigns are regarded, rightly so, with caution and concern because their side effects of stigma and scapegoating can be so toxic. Those worries have been shaped by an awareness of the formidable power of traditional media, newspaper, radio, TV, for example, and now the new, quote, quote, social media to amplify public health messaging in unexpected and undesirable ways. In this talk, Toms will present a brief history of what she terms the panic problem in America, public health practice to stimulate a discussion of these questions. How do we motivate people to act in public health crisis without inducing some degree of fear? Is there a place for healthy fear in public health messaging today? And if so, what would it look like?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Having me, this is a new project for me, so I have at this point more questions than I do answers, but I'm really interested in getting your feedback. If there are people, let's see if we can get this off the bat. She's not getting her. Hello, it'll come. Sorry. Yes, okay. Those of you who are film buffs may recognize in my title, homage to Panic in the Streets, a 1950 film directed by Elia Kazan, which I'll discuss later in my talk. My goal is to try to unpack some of the historical baggage around the term panic and its near relations, fear and hysteria. Why am I interested in this? I'm a historian of public health. I spent the COVID years doing a deep dive into both history and policy history of responses to global epidemics and pandemics. And if you're interested, I would love it if you download this and in your abundant free time, have a read. With my colleague Manon Perry, I did a historical review of the concept of an infodemic. It's a word blend of information and epidemic for the WHO EU's division. My conversations with the WHO EU staff charged with what is known as risk management and community engagement during COVID gave me new insight into how incredibly difficult their job is in combating misinformation and the fear that it produces. And in thinking of obstacles, as I finished this report, two issues jumped out at me that I wanted to think more about. First, panic, how it's conceptualized in public health as something to be avoided at all costs. And second, how concerns about panic and fear shape media messaging about outbreaks. What should be minimized, what should be amplified. Now, these are issues that are getting some that have gotten interest and are even more so with COVID. These are just a sample of some of the books on my bookshelf at the National Humanities Center that I'm using perspectives from the history of empire, the sociology of catastrophe, the outbreak narrative as a literary phenomena, studies of the social amplification of risk, and studies of virality and activism. And I welcome your suggestions if you think there are things that should be added. I do have a list of references if you're interested later. What I need to do before going forward here is just to do some terminology definition. What is my working, and believe me, I keep it simple. You could spend hours just discussing these terms, but I'm keeping it simple. This is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of panic: sudden, wild, unreasoning, or excessive state of fear or alarm. It is in the affect family of fear, which psychologists categorize as one of the most basic human emotions. Both fear and panic are states that in public health settings you want to avoid provoking. Now, I am only discussing panic in a public health context today. I'm setting aside psychiatric conceptions as in panic disorder. I am interested in this in the larger project, but it was just too much to talk about today. So I'm thinking about panic primarily in the context of responding to acute public health emergencies. Okay, so what do I mean by that? There are lots of definitions of what constitutes an acute emergency. That includes hurricanes, toxic spills, and bioterrorism. Today, I'm just talking about naturally occurring epidemics. What is a crisis in this context? These are some of the standard definitions. I've highlighted what are to me the key bits: that the threat has the potential for death or long-term disability of large numbers, and it represents a disruption of routine capabilities. Now, in fact, what we might think of as examples of full-blown panic, think stampeding to the fire exit, leaving town in large numbers, rioting and looting, the kinds of things you see in movies, have not been a frequent occurrence in the 20th century US. But the threat of panic and the fearful emotions and behaviors attributed to that panic and the fear around it have become much more common at the individual and the collective level, a dynamic that is often attributed to the impact of the mass media. Now, having read a lot in the past 2 years about public health messaging, I have found many articulations of what I think of as the over-under problem. Americans either overreact to the wrong outbreaks, Ebola, Zika, or they underreact to the real ones, HIV and now COVID. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but I have to say, in my view, the idea of the assumptions about whether people are fearing more and fearing right or wrong things, we need to treat very critically. Obviously, I've been surprised in my work to find that there are no widely agreed upon standards for defining or measuring when fear is justified or when it becomes irrational. Obviously, your point of view makes a huge difference here. Yet it's surprising how often in discussions of risk and messaging, they start with the assumptions that the risk is clear and then quickly move on to categorizing who is responding to it and in the wrong ways. Much of, in my opinion, the best work being done today around public health messaging does not blow by the questions of uncertainty and complexity that exist around the concept of risk and disease threat as concepts. A critical mindset, I think, is especially important because accusations of inducing unnecessary panic are now deeply politicized in the United States. And we'll get to that at the end. So this brings me to the last term that I have to define, and that is, what do I mean by mass media? Again, I'm keeping it real simple here. Means of communication that reach large numbers of people in a short time. Of course, these methods have evolved over time. These are the ones we deal with now. I often hear in contemporary discussions of fake news and information two assumptions that I'm here to question. The first is that the problem of fake news and misinformation is primarily media generated, that good scientific information is being twisted out of context by these media actors. The second is that the amplification problem, the people getting scared of too many things, has only really gotten out of hand since the 2010s in the expansion of social media. I disagree on both counts. I refer you to that Hen report where we lay out our evidence. In fact, the problems originate on the science side as well as the media side, and they long predate Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and TikTok. So my historical project is an effort to step back and put this mess in long-term context. I think history can help by showing how our basic ideas about information and messaging have been shaped by concerns about panic and fear. So I'm going to try to convince you of that. And start with a quick overview of how panic has figured as a public health problem. Now, in what follows, I'm only focusing on the last century and in the United States. I know the problems go back much further. They are not new, they're not unprecedented, and they exist not just in the United States. This is a transnational set of issues. But I can only deal with the US in the last century today. Second, my focus here is on public health as a science and a profession, not on medicine. Really critical, since there's nobody in here from public health, or some of you may, yes, thank you. I am not discussing medical conceptions of risk and individual educational tactics around individualized preventive medicine. My interest is in the collective and the mass, not the individual. And in fact, this is what really matters in an emergency, is that collective, which is one reason I'm focusing on it. So as I hope to show you, in the first half of the 20th century, if you look at the core of public health, there was not a lot of detailed thinking or planning about how to communicate with the public in the event of a fast-moving disease capable of causing massive disruption, such as the 1918 flu. This was not because leaders didn't recognize fear and panic as potential problems. They did. But they were working hard to avoid having to rely on the masses to stop a fast-moving epidemic in the first place. And to the extent that they thought they needed to communicate about an epidemic to the public, they outsourced that messaging to other groups, particularly voluntary health organizations, and a largely deferential, at that point, mainstream media. In the second half of the 20th century, that approach unraveled, most spectacular during the 1980s HIV/AIDS epidemic. As a result, what we now call risk communication and community engagement has become vastly more important in modern public health. But for many reasons, both doing it well and also securing the funding for it are still incredibly difficult. The problem of panic and fear is one of the complications in this mass messaging. So that's a story I'm going to try to lay it out for you very quickly. Let me start with a little context about 19th century public health. As a science and profession, it grew up first and foremost as a response to infectious diseases, especially epidemics of diseases like cholera, yellow fever, and smallpox. Its goal was to apply new scientific methods to figure out how diseases spread and prevent them, first by investments in infrastructure, sanitary engineering, and strategic containment by surveillance, quarantine, and isolation of places, cities, neighborhoods, and people likely to be infected. And finally, where possible, the development and use of vaccines and antitoxins. Now, remember, there are no sulfa drugs until the late 1930s, and there are no antibiotics until the 1940s. So all this 19th century stuff is going on without pharmaceutical tools of intervention. Now, that first strategy, the infrastructure, was mind-bogglingly expensive and labor-intensive. Think of digging sewers and building water aqueducts in big cities with the labor only of people and animals. But in many ways, it was easier to dig a sewer than it was to conduct that second strategy, which was to control the spread of epidemics in a world of increasingly networked big cities that were well connected via ships, trains, and news media. Measures such as quarantine and isolation were not only difficult to execute, but extremely unpopular. Once a disease such as cholera or yellow fever hit a town, public health officials faced the panic problem. People would try to flee the city and potentially take the pathogen with them. Public health authorities would try to calm matters by publishing notices and guidelines in newspapers. That was their main means of mass messaging in this 19th century, but that messaging could make the panic and the fear even worse. Herein lay the appeal of something called the new public health, which emerges in the early 1900s and really dominates from the 1930s, 1920s, in some ways to this day. It was a more precise scientific approach to detection and prevention that would do a better job of stamping the epidemic out. This approach deployed improving laboratory methods of detection, stronger police powers for surveillance at national borders, immigrants in particular, and within cities to identify carriers of infection, trace their contacts, and isolate them so they couldn't spread the disease more. Now, one of the important testing grounds for these new public health approaches was overseas, in the colonies that the US acquired during the 1898 Spanish-American War. And another was the screening of immigrants as a means to limit infectious diseases. These are two of the most influential US Surgeon Generals of the early 20th century. And their careers illustrate the military and colonial context of disease control in this time period. Gorgas was famous for his work in controlling yellow fever in Cuba, Rupert Blue for managing bubonic plague in San Francisco's Chinatown, yellow fever in New Orleans, and malarial control in Hawaii. These were important experiences for thinking about the problem of panic. Now, panic had long been a concern in the military. Wars could be lost if your troops panicked and ran from the fight. It also posed a significant problem when you were trying to do colonial infrastructure, the construction of the Panama Canal being one influential example. Workers got sick and fled from the construction. That experience fed into a preferred model within early 20th century public health that wished for a more top-down command and control model. It was a model steeped in a low opinion of the ability other than people like them, educated white male experts, to think or behave sensibly. It reflects the deeply race and gendered science and conceptions of rationality in this era. Beings that, and this is not my opinion, I'm repeating what was a common set of assumptions held in the early 20th century, that people being supposedly lower on the evolutionary scale, that included all women, people of color, working class people, recent immigrants, etc., were much more likely to get unreasonably scared, whatever that meant, and behave badly, say resisting public health orders, spreading rumors and such like. So it was best not to have to depend on them. These views carried over into public health understandings of the domestic masses that needed to be managed in big American cities. But unlike a military or a colonial settings, public health officers had far less firepower to command in getting people to behave during an epidemic crisis. An officer, for example, could order a man who panicked to be jailed or even shot. That kind of swift, aggressive action in a big American city was not possible. To be sure, cities and states enacted tougher and tougher public health laws to deal with these kinds of problems, but they were incredibly hard to enforce, especially as cities got bigger and more connected. If you read public health writings about disease outbreaks in the early 1900s, their frustration with managing the masses, as they thought of it, is palpable. Now, this is the context for understanding that new public health I mentioned, which became very popular in the post-World War I era, with its focus on stamping out the embers of infection before they broke through to the whole community. So the idea you would use your better scientific methods of detection, you'd surveil and find the individuals who were sick, and you would isolate them before they could spread the disease to someone else. And the goal here was to stop epidemics of diseases such as polio or influenza before they had a chance to spread widely. They were largely successful in this enterprise, in part because overall rates of infectious diseases were falling. Where those diseases remained a serious threat to health, it was among communities regarded by elite white thinkers as disposable. Tuberculosis, once a common infection, had become, in the words of historian Baron Lerner, a skid row disease by the interwar period. Rates of syphilis and gonorrhea became associated with sex workers in Black neighborhoods. So to the extent that their illnesses and deaths seemed to threaten the predominantly white majority, they got attention, but otherwise not. The Tuskegee syphilis study being one tragic example of this neglect. Where public health officials did need help was in cultivating broad public support, in particular from taxpayers. But the actual work of informing the public about infectious diseases became far less central to public health work in the interwar era. The public health profession instead relied on others, chiefly voluntary health organizations and public public school educators, to do that educational work. This is one of the classic examples, the March of Dimes, and the education campaign regarding polio control, and that if you don't recognize her as the actress Grace Kelly helping them. Now, both public health departments and voluntary health organizations depended on a generally supportive mainstream media, at this point, newspapers and radios, to amplify its messaging. Then as now, public health, neither voluntary organizations or public health departments had the communication bandwidth to get messages out on, especially on short notice. And so they had to rely on these media forms to do it for them. So they emerged what I think of as a gentleman's agreement between local public health departments, voluntary health organizations, and the media about how to report on potentially panic-inducing diseases. And that was very, very carefully. You might think, but couldn't the media get more people to buy its products if they stoked fears of an impending pandemic? In fact, the mainstream newspapers were strongly beholden to local political and business interests who did not want any kind of disruption and really did not want that kind of amplification to take place. So this brings me to the example I want to share of you of how this gentleman's agreement worked. I'm going to use a fictive example, the 1950 film, Panic in the Streets. Anybody here ever seen it? It's something. It's not based on a true story, but the film does very well express some of the complex dynamics that were play around the panic problem. And I highly recommend the excellent piece that my colleagues, Alex Stern and Howard Markell wrote about the film. Directed by Elia Kazan, Panic in the Streets revolved around efforts to limit an outbreak of pneumonic plague in New Orleans. These efforts played out against a raft of stereotypes. New Orleans is portrayed as ripe for infection because of its many Black and brown residents, its ties with foreign trade, and its resident gangsters. The initial case is described as a mixed race man from abroad who has the pneumonic form of the plague and introduces it into NOLA's poorer dock neighborhoods before dying of it. A partnership then forms between an officer in the public health services and a police captain to try to stop its spread. So the primary hero of the film is Dr. Reed on the right, played by Richard Whitmore, showing here looking very frazzled because no one is listening to him. And helping him quite grumpily is the police captain on the Mackey in the middle, played by Paul Douglas wearing the hat. The other man, you'll see, is protecting them with a shotgun. So it gives you some sense of the dangers that they fear. Dr. Reed uses classic new public health techniques to stamp the ember of pneumonic plague out. Surveillance, isolation, forced inoculation with an anti-plague or semi-forced inoculation with anti-plague serum. And throughout this battle, he is frantic to keep news of the outbreak under wraps. Why? He wants to avoid panic in the streets. Panic that would send NOLA's residents rushing to the train stations or hopping in their cars and then spreading the pneumonic plague through them. Now, initially, the police and other government officials are glad to keep the story under wraps. Here they are around the mayor's table discussing all these issues. And they're saying, Mardi Gras is just around the corner. We don't want to lose business in Mardi Gras. But a reporter who works the police beat has observed something big is going on. People are being brought in for questioning. The police are being vaccinated. He wants the story. And note by 1950, moviegoers were very familiar with the newspaper man who wanted to get the story. That was part of what modern journalism was all about, and certainly not seen as illegitimate. If you will recall, Superman, also known as Clark Kent, was a newspaper man. But this clash of perspectives plays out in what to me was a jaw-dropping scene in the movie. And I'm sorry I couldn't find a still. This has not gotten much attention in the writings about this film. The reporter confronts the police captain and the public health doctor and says, what's up? They confirm his suspicions and that it is indeed the bubonic plague, but then they tell him he can't print the story. The reporter responds, well, I represent the public and they have a right to know what's going on. The police captain then puts him in jail to keep him from writing the story, releasing the story. Now, when the mayor hears of this, he is very concerned, largely because other reporters here, this guy has been locked up and are swarming him. And the mayor meets with the police chief and public health doctor. And I'm just going to read you some of the dialogue. The mayor, before I give the story, the reporter the story, I want your confirmation that the disease can be contained and there is no reason for panic. The police chief says to his doctor colleague, our only chance for cooperation is an informed public, Clint. But again, the public health officer says no. The minute he publishes it, this is his dialogue, the men we're looking for will leave the city. I told it to you once, I'll tell you again. Anyone leaving here with plague endangers the entire company. One of the locals says, but the rest of the country doesn't have it. We do. And the doctor responds, do you think you're living in the Middle Ages? Anybody that lives here can be in any city in the country within 10 hours. I could leave here today and be in Africa tomorrow. And whatever disease I have would go right with me. We're all in a community, the same one. The doctor loses the argument and the mayor hands a report to be published over to the reporter. But here's the Hollywood ending. It's the middle of the night, so the reporter can't get the story out for a couple of hours. And that gives the doctor and the police chief just enough time to find the person who's eluded them and to prevent further spread of the plague. This film captures a growing tension between the logic of the new public health, do the contact tracing, focus on the undesirables, and solve the outbreak before the word gets out, and the logic of investigative journalism. The Hollywood ending allowed the clash between the public's right to know and the prevention of panic to be easily resolved. But for a lot of reasons, that Hollywood ending was becoming far less realistic. So now on quickly to the second half, and I think you're going to be more familiar with what's about to happen. After World War II, the need for persuasive forms of science communication escalated post-Holocaust and post-Hiroshima. There's a huge upsurge in public worries about science without accountability and a belief that citizens and voters needed to be better informed. Science communication as a profession started to become more professionalized and prestigious. You didn't leave it to March of Dimes or school teachers anymore. And its proponents sought to craft more unbiased alternatives both to corporate public relations and activist rhetorics in talking about disease problems. This approach built on conceptions of information as a commodity, standardized and packaged for public consumption. And it added to that a very important new element, appeals to a new science of risk assessment based on the understanding of probabilities. The chance of developing lung cancer if you smoke are 1 in whatever. The chance of a nuclear energy plant meltdown are 1 in whatever. Explain the issues, provide those numbers in an objective style, free of any emotion at all, and the public will make the right choices. Put down that cigarette and stop worrying about the nuclear plant around the corner. But if you know anything about the history of the 1960s and 1970s, you can imagine that this style of rational communication was likely to run into some trouble. This is an era of challenges to institutional expertise, to just so many of the basic assumptions of society that this kind of accepting of risk communication is really, it's very difficult to succeed. Originally framed around individual choices like the choice to smoke, it really starts to get complicated with problems associated with worst cases involving environmental disasters. What was the role of a responsible press in reporting on issues such as the 3 Mile Island meltdown or Love Canal? Whose voices should be listened to? Scientific experts, company reps, or affected citizens? That old gentleman's agreement about public health and media relationships came under siege. This is an extraordinary account of exactly how fraught that relationship had gotten to be by 1984, well before Twitter, folks. It's like a kind of a task force report that really shows the kinds of problems around communicating risk. By Science in the Streets, again, note the kind of panic in the streets, science in the streets. This was a group of leaders from public health and media to try to work out a new kind of gentleman's agreement about what should be reported about environmental problems, and they failed to come to any agreement, in large part because they couldn't decide, and this is a quote, where the line should be drawn between what the public is told and what it is not, between the right time to reveal the data and the wrong time, between press freedom and self-restraint by the press. This report fascinates me for a lot of reasons, but particularly because they lasted long enough to start getting some hints of AIDS coming along and really upending this whole structure. Very little discussion about infectious diseases in the 1970s as a problem that this whole risk communication needed to think about. And again, that's because in many ways, the assumption was by the 1970s that mass outbreaks of a disease are just not going to happen. We have drugs, we have public health surveillance. The appearance of HIV/AIDS punctured that sense of confidence and put infectious diseases back on the public health agenda as a risk to be reckoned with. Now, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. I hope you may have some knowledge about the early AIDS epidemic in the United States. A library of books has been written about the messaging failings around AIDS, and I'm just going to highlight a few essential points. First, there were failures on both sides, the science side as well as the media side. On both sides, homophobia, sexism, and racism undercut claims or efforts to be objective and scientific. The storyline often heard about AIDS in the media suggests a progression from silence to sensationalism. Indeed, mainstream print and broadcast outlets cared little about the epidemic in its early years. Then around the time that actor Rock Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS, they started to cover it more, but badly. While there is some truth to this, this arc, it neglects an important fact in my view, and that is that the alternative press serving the gay and lesbian community was on the AIDS story from the outset, insisting that it was important and it needed national attention. But their coverage got dismissed as panic-inducing and fear-mongering and hysterical. And this served as a convenient excuse for the mainstream media to ignore AIDS. If they were not at risk, AIDS had no standing as a story of mass interest. And underlying this dismissal was a level of toxic homophobia and racism in the mainstream media industry. Once the media did start to cover AIDS, the challenge of reporting on it remained. As HIV infection spread and AIDS deaths rose, the fears associated with the outbreak could not be ignored. But who should be afraid of AIDS and why? For gay men and IV drug users, the fears might seem warranted. Where it was seemingly out of proportion was in people who in behavioral terms were not at high risk, thought to be at high risk in the 1980s. For example, straight white women who consistently polled as the demographic most worried about AIDS in the 1980s. Now, in general, most post-1985 media coverage of AIDS was a huge stigma generator. There were positive moments. You can see in the group ACT UP's media savvy in pushing back against that media silence. This is a famous poster drawn by the artist Keith Haring. Celebrity involvement, think Elton John and Ryan White humanized the face of people with AIDS to some extent, but could not overcome the homophobia, the racism, or the disdain for IV drug users and sex workers that was hard baked into the AIDS response. And meanwhile, people with HIV suffered from others' fears in horrible ways, mistreated by healthcare workers and policemen and shunned by their neighbors and friends. Now, out of this tragedy did come fundamental changes in public health messaging that in many ways represented a great leap forward and still shape the ideas in public health today. A recommitment to community-based collaborations and partnerships with grassroots leaders who in general did a much better job of framing and delivering messages about self-protection and preservation than did the public health experts. And these are just some of the examples of 1980s materials produced on the left by San Francisco gay groups and on the right by a Philadelphia Neighborhood Association that worked much better than those top-down kind of messages. And that, again, the success of these kinds of efforts definitely moved, is part of the two steps forward part of this story. Unfortunately, how to communicate about disease threats and many other topics got entangled in the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. There arose very different conservative and liberal media storylines about panic and fear. In both, panic and fear were bad and largely generated by a biased media, but with different root causes depending on the critics' politics. And these debates certainly deepened public distrust of public health messaging. And as HIV became perceived as a global pandemic, you also get a lot of othering of infectious diseases as something located out the United States. Well, I hope this talk has given you some idea of the complexities of the ideas that we now wrestle with in terms of how you do mass messaging during a acute public health emergency involving an infectious disease. And I don't need to tell you the kind of relevance of these topics to COVID. And many of the problems that we have encountered have been discussed and anticipated in public health planning documents, of which I've read many, and they'll look at an outbreak and say, gosh, we need to do better with risk communication and community engagement, and money never follows. And so if we're going to do better, these are the kinds of issues that we need to address. What do I see as the way forward here? I would say just starting with the paying more attention to panic and fear and not assuming that they are emotions to be gotten rid of, but rather understood and anticipated. That requires critiquing a still powerful style of information that assumes good data will drive out bad thinking. And in fact, there's a lot of new neuroscience that suggests, nope, not the case. There's a lot of great work being done in the humanities about this, and I hope you'll have a chance at some point in your medical training to hear more about it. I'm going to conclude with questions that I've got and hope we have a few minutes left for discussion. I'd say in terms of priority, the top question about how you try to get people to change behaviors in protective ways without scaring them and inducing stigma is a problem that we really need to focus on more. Is it possible to have healthy fear? Or should we throw it out entirely? Public health thinking, really most of it has been thrown out, never works. But it's been about chronic diseases, smoking and sexually acquired diseases. Is there a place for healthy fear in a global pandemic? To me, when you start thinking about there are 332 million Americans, how do you come up with any set of single messages that's going to make sense to them? And in fact, if anything, I've gotten a lot more, not sympathetic, but just the scale of the problem is really horrific. My sense is we would do better if we had networks in place. Well, first, if we took care of these problems, the underlying problems would really help. But if we really invested in those community networks that should something come along, you could rely on. Again, people have been saying this for a long time and it doesn't get done. Where do we put the money? We put it into ever more sophisticated information technology, surveillance measures, really top down. stuff. We don't put it into this. I'm going to hush there and open the floor and hope I get some questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Toms. Yeah, we'll be doing a brief Q&A now. People on Zoom, please put in your questions in the chat box.
If anyone in here has questions also.
And also, if you have to leave, as I know you might, and you want to say something, send me an email. Love to hear from you.
Thank you.
I'm familiar with this novel, but I'm glad you came. I really am. Yeah, you're welcome. And fix things. Go and fix things. Oh, you're our best host.
We have a question on Zoom.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, it is interesting that older approaches suggested that those lower on the evolutionary scale would be more likely to panic. However, during COVID, some undesirable groups, for example, rural Appalachians, among others, showed very low levels of panic. I'm curious why we saw this shift, or if it was actually already there and just ignored by those in power.
So, yeah, low, I mean, in general, panic has not been a major aspect of people's responses to crises, and that is studies have documented that. So I guess my sense is that the potential for this kind of panic was never as much as the leaders were making it out to be. So COVID, in a way, just kind of illustrated. You go back to the 1918 influenza, not large-scale examples of panic, and that was a really massive and disruptive event. So I may not be entirely understanding the question, but I think the idea that people can't be trusted with information because they will misuse it or play up things like, oh, they'll go and try to buy all the toilet paper in the grocery store, and this is a sign of irrationality. It's almost like we're looking for ways to kind of decide that people can't be trusted with information.
Kind of bouncing off of that, just in your broad picture view.
Just so people on Zoom can hear you.
Yeah. In your broad picture view, have you seen that when the general population was informed of an epidemic event earlier into the epidemic, if there have been better outcomes, worse outcomes, or no change?
It's, I'd say yes, with an asterisk in that it's really hard from the evidence we have about historical events to completely understand what was going on. But I'd say overall, a well-timed sharing of information, even if it seems potentially frightening, works better than not telling people anything, especially if it appears to be a silence imposed for political or economic reasons. So, you know, the idea that people aren't told something because the powers that be want to be able to do what they want to do instead of responding to citizen concerns. Fears of, and this is a really critical issue that I hope gets more attention, about censorship and self-censorship, that whistleblowers, healthcare people who have a story that's not what the powers that be want to get out, can be in you know, the example of what happens to the reporter, panic in the streets. It's a real it's a real problem, and not just in so-called authoritarian countries, but in the United States. I'm deeply concerned about the politicization because there are these extraordinary, to me, books coming out about the problem of panic. But the problem of panic is they overreacted to COVID because liberals are the fear mongers, and sort of complete cherry picking of what happened in COVID to argue that it was all a big mistake to respond the way we did. And that's really one of the basic reasons I think we've got to talk about how panic is used as an accusation as we go forward, because it's really out there in scary ways.
Okay, we also have a comment from Richard Kahn. Thanks, Nancy, that was great. New England Journal of Medicine recently pointed out that 30% plus Americans are innumerate, telling them 30% get this outcome doesn't inform. In the 1980s, there was a great article questioning different groups on the greatest risk to live, statisticians versus League of Women Voters, etc. So that was just a comment. And then we have a question from Barry Saunders. The term moral panic, when it crops up, is it mostly about judgments of overreaction?
That is such a good question. And in part of my work is trying to untangle all the different conceptions. There's moral panic. There's an older thing called herd panic. I was like, what is that? It's the idea that panic spreads. Today we talk about contagious emotions. Moral panic was a conception mostly among sociologists of trying to understand what were the conditions under which panic would spread. But in a lot of what they say is really interesting, but it always worried me that it had this tone of, we know what you should really be worrying about. So labeling something a moral panic was a way of dismissing it. And I wasn't quite comfortable in going that route, but it is definitely, the moral panic thing is part of the bigger picture I'm looking at. Just to go back to Richie's point, the problems with probabilistic ways, I mean, that has been documented for decades, and yet we don't seem to be able, or some of us just can't stop doing it. I really love the work of Lee Clark. He's the Worst Cases, where he just offers a brilliant critique of I can't even say it. Risk assessment based on probabilities, and he talks about the idea of a possibility. If you are, and I'll just use a COVID example, if you're a restaurant worker whose whole family is dependent on your income, your sense of what the risks are if you go to work are different because there's a possibility you'll get sick and not be able to support your family, or you may not be able to wear a mask at work, whatever. It's like, these are real possibilities in your life that those kind of sterile numbers just do not help with. And yet, let me tell you, where does most of the money and scientific effort go into? It's in generating probabilities and modeling of who's at risk from what. Enormous amount of effort that still goes into that, despite all these critiques. Anybody else on there?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Going back to like what you were saying about like whether or not fear has a place in like public health messaging, like what are your thoughts about the fact that people are saying like the COVID pandemic is over when we still have like hundreds of Americans dying of COVID every day? On the flip side, like major media right now is giving a lot of voice to like anti-trans activists saying like, oh, like you shouldn't be allowing like kids to transition, and like transitioning is like a huge issue, and like putting fear out there when that's not maybe like the main trans experience. Like how do you reckon with like where fear is considered quote unquote like justified versus not justified in terms of like major media. How do you think about that?
Well, I think about it. Do I have a good answer? No. And a lot of what I'm trying to think about is alternatives to these ways of thinking. I mean, one of the kind of trendy things to talk about is, at least in some public health circles, is the idea of pre-bunking. This is a really weird word. Debunking is where you try to convince people something's not true. Pre-bunking is where you try to get some good information in there that will then keep them from going down the misinformation path. To me, it's just really hard to figure out, how do you anticipate what the news of the day is going to be in order to pre-bunk it or post-bunk it or whatever. Ultimately, I'll tell you what I myself have to think through is becoming, and golly, I hate to say this, a more critical consumer myself of the information that I'm getting, and then to try to develop networks so I will be informed enough that I don't buy that argument that the anti-trans people are putting out. The one about should we back off COVID now? Epidemics do tail out. This one has been going on a long time. There's a really good piece by a couple of my historian colleagues about when do epidemics end. It hasn't ended, but can we can't continue some of the more strict kinds of tactics we used before. So I guess my kind of personal position is to wear masks. I'm not today because I'm talking, but to wear my mask, to be respectful and encouraging of people who say, I'm going to sit outside to eat because I'm still concerned about COVID, and be supportive of that, and try to get institutions to be supportive of that. It's a really wishy-washy answer. I wish I had a better.
Okay, and I think we have one more question from Madeline Nieto. Would you consider this work to be part of decolonizing methodologies, especially for this field?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I'm humbled by my lack of knowledge, but absolutely, I see this very much in line of looking at these colonial influences on public health thinking that there's a lack of awareness of. Well, historians are aware of it. There has been critical commentary, but I don't think it's gotten much. Core of public health, I think is still struggling to kind of figure out what to do and to decolonize itself in terms of its methods, especially around communicating. I'll tell you, in some ways, when I read the kind of global efforts, for example, around communicating with Ebola in an outbreak in West Africa, I'm really, it's like a really, I don't know how good it is, but it's really thoughtful. And then I come back and look at the way we talk about our own campaigns, and I'm thinking that's not thoughtful at all. It's kind of like somehow we're these beings that don't, that can be talked to about probabilities, and we don't need that kind of cultural sensitivity. And I think we do.
And for anyone on the Zoom who wants to know what Richard Kahn, the article that he was talking about, the recently published The Contagion of Liberty, The Politics of Smallpox in the American Revolution by Andrew Werman. is what he's talking about.
Good. Yes. Cool book.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr.
Yes.
Toms, for this lecture. Thank you for everyone that attended in person and virtually. We invite you to the next Bullitt Club lecture, April 4th at noon, titled The Healing Art, Early Modern Economies of Care, with Mandy Fowler, who's a doctoral student in English and Comparative Literature at UNC Chapel Hill. Mandy is the recipient of the 2022-2023 McClendon-Thomas Award, a fellowship through UNC Libraries Special Collections, which supports research on the history of medicine. Thank you.
Thank you.